countries where things are moving on well. So we decided to focus on those that we think are problematic and where we think that there is need for some action. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Just a regional overview, more like how is the region probably performing in terms of food security. So households in most surplus producing countries continue consumption of the main season. And in these countries, definitely supplies will likely to probably be available across the 2022-2023 consumption period. But definitely we all know how the region has behaved with those areas that were affected by drought and floods, obviously because of cyclones. We've actually seen households starting to deplete their own produced staple and food commodities, and they are increasing reliance on market purchases and humanitarian assistance. And some of the affected countries include parts of Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Madagascar, especially the Grand South, Angola, and Malawi. For these countries that I've mentioned, parts of those countries where the impacts of either drought, floods, we are actually expecting an earlier than usual lean season. In some of the areas, actually, we can safely say the lean season has already started, given that the level of harvest was so low that it lasted maybe 1 to 2 months. Then as we think about the drought-affected countries, we don't need to forget our conflict areas of DRC and, of course, Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, where, you know, there hasn't been any meaningful agriculture, and as such, there hasn't been any meaningful harvest as well. So in those areas, once again, there are serious needs and levels of food insecurity remain very concerning. Another common phenomenon is the deterioration of macroeconomic conditions in some of these countries that I've already mentioned, which is also probably worsening the, household access to staple market purchases. Obviously, economic conditions are difficult. Think about, how inflation is kind of keeping the Zimbabwean situation complex. The same story you hear in Malawi and also Madagascar. So it's one of those things that we think at regional level is kind of affecting, overall food security issues. The only probably good thing that you pick from this overview is definitely some kind of indications on how this season will likely look like. For those that have been more like studying what's happening by the Pacific region, which in most cases give us an indicative, picture of sea surface temperatures. The conditions there remain consistent with La Nina and raising prospects of average rains in most parts of not the season, but the region. So I think that's something that we are monitoring. It's too early to probably give conclusions, but I think it's good enough to give us indicative picture of how the season is likely to progress. Let's move on, please. So we have tried to kind of provide, as usual, an update of number one, current conditions and also projected conditions for selected areas of concern. And we have done this for Madagascar, Mozambique, Angola, and Zimbabwe. Malawi challenged us a bit, and we are hoping to tackle it probably separately in the next FNSWG sessions. But at least for these ones, we've tried to come up with some kind of an update, a very short summary of the prevailing conditions and also the projected conditions all the way to perhaps March 2023. Next slide, please. All right, just looking at Madagascar, in the current situation, the southern, southwestern, and southeastern areas, for those areas we have households, we have started accessing cassava and sweet potatoes from the main harvest. For those of us who have been dealing with Madagascar, you know the complexity of the seasons there. It's different from other parts of the region. At the present moment, there's some harvesting that is happening on cassava, sweet potatoes, on some of those areas that I've just mentioned. And so there's that consumption of tubers. But I guess it's important for me to just highlight that production is below average, and this is mainly because of poor soil moisture conditions and limited access to inputs. We all know the background that some of those areas, especially the Grand South, has been affected by consecutive droughts, and as such, inputs became so limited. Then poor households in drought-stricken southern areas depleted unproduced maize, and in a number of instances, those households are essentially relying on humanitarian assistance. And then given below a significant reduction in maize production, households are experiencing earlier than usual dependence on markets. Next slide, please. Still in the current supplies of key commodities, staple commodities like maize, cassava, and rice is around average in most markets across the country. However, in the Grand South, which is one of our areas of concern, supplies are below average due to production reductions and also high transportation costs, which is also resulting in significant increases in prices for key food commodities. For example, in Tolia, you notice that maize prices in July increased by, my apologies, there's a pop-up that came up on my slide there. Some people are joining. Okay, so I was indicating that for maize prices, if you look at the July prices, I know Jones is going to probably get into more details on this, but prices were essentially 15% above last year and about 103 above the 5-year average. And then if you look at dried cassava, prices increased by 82% compared to 2021 and were about 211% above the 5-year average. Those are not small increases, especially when you look at the 5-year average. Then disposable incomes have been eroded by inflation, as I earlier alluded in my introductory overview of the region. It's one of those areas where inflation has been on the increase, and that has definitely affected disposable incomes for households. There's something funny. I can't see the last point on that slide. I think the way it's configured, I can't see it from this end. But another key thing to just mention for southern Madagascar is definitely the issue of the purchasing power for most households. It has been a great challenge, obviously, because income earning opportunities are limited against probably increasing prices for key commodities, and that is taking a tall order on a number of households, and it's limiting their access to key commodities. Let's move on to the next slide, which is talking about the projected outcomes. IPC Phase 3 Plus outcomes are expected in southwestern Madagascar. If for those who are familiar with the geography of the Grand South, we're looking at areas around Ampani, which have been persistently affected by drought conditions. And in those areas, we're expecting IPC phase 3 plus, meaning that we can go to as far as IPC phase 4 in those areas, especially in the peak clean season. Households' access to food will further deteriorate with the progression of the lean season. So as much as we are beginning to see some deficits now, we are expecting those to even become worse as we move to periods around maybe December, January, February into March. So certainly we are expecting some kind of a progression of the sort of challenges in those areas. There are expectations, cautious expectations that labor opportunities will certainly start to feature, especially as we move around the start of the 2023 to 2022 to 2023 agricultural season in October. But I want to just give a cautious statement about southern Madagascar in the sense that in the most recent past, there has been some challenges, especially on the seasonal evolution in those areas, in the sense that, for instance, last year there were projections that rainfall was likely to increase as consistent with La Nina conditions, but that didn't happen. We ended up seeing a very erratic start of the season and also below average rains, especially for the period October through December. So because of those inconsistencies, as much as we are expecting labor opportunities because of the La Nina conditions that I've already mentioned, we need to be cautious in the sense that if the situation becomes like what we saw last year, definitely that will change the outcomes. So another thing about those agricultural labors as a way of coping for a number of households, there is a bit of a challenge in the sense that because of the consecutiveness of the problems in the southern parts of Madagascar, even the better off households who normally provide those opportunities were equally affected. And that means that, supply will definitely be limited. So as a result, poor and very poor households are expected to employ unsustainable consumption and livelihood coping strategies. By consumption, we're looking at things like a reduction of meals and perhaps both quantities and frequency of meals. And by livelihood coping strategies, we are looking at probably those very negative coping mechanisms like selling of key assets and also accelerated levels of migration. Next slide, please. Let's just look at how the situation is looking like for Mozambique. There are those areas that have been affected by cyclones, and also we have the conflict-affected areas. So for central Mozambique and perhaps southern and central parts of Mozambique, we know that the main driver was essentially prolonged dry spells and also, cyclones around February and March. And those have contributed to levels of IPC phase 3 and IPC phase 2 that we are seeing in some of those areas. So as we speak right now, some households in those areas are experiencing IPC phase 2 outcomes, while others are obviously showing evidence of crisis IPC phase 3 outcomes. Just like the picture that we have seen for southern Madagascar, household food stocks are fast deteriorating, which is why I've already alluded to the fact that for some parts of the region, definitely, the lean season seems to have started. And there are also limited income generating opportunities, which definitely affect the amount of cash circulating among the very poor households, meaning that as much as markets may be well supplied, they don't have access to those commodities because they don't have the purchasing power. For the conflict areas in Cabo Delgado, definitely crisis IPC outcomes persist due to disruption of agriculture and other livelihoods activities. And humanitarian assistance, especially in the Cabo Delgado area, is preventing further deterioration of food insecurity outcomes. So without humanitarian assistance, it's very much possible that around Cabo Delgado would have seen worse off outcomes. So let's look at the projected outcomes. Most of those poor households will likely experience food consumption deficits as their own produce staple has already been depleted, or in some cases it's starting to be depleted, and in other cases it has already been depleted. And access to markets is definitely will definitely be affected by increases in prices, some of which is linked to Ukraine. I suspect that Jones and Mina will probably get into this in more details, but we will certainly know how increases in commodities like fuel has also triggered significant price increases. And coupled with the drought conditions that were experienced in the last agricultural season, definitely that is affecting those prices. And I guess the very poor households are being affected by those price dynamics. And then in conflict affected areas, continued displacements is likely to limit access to income earning opportunities and engagement in agricultural activities. Even for the 2022-2023 season, I think it's still very tricky for Cabo Delgado, as much as we have seen some level of stability in the past couple of weeks, but it's still not guaranteed that it's going to be stable across the consumption period. And then in urban and peri-urban areas, high fuel and wheat prices are expected to continue. And that will definitely affect poor households' access to those commodities, given that we have already alluded to the fact that they've some weak purchasing power. And so crisis IPC outcomes will likely to prevail in most drought-affected areas and conflict-ravaged Cabo Delgado province. So this is more like the outlook. We're not expecting any improvements in the outcomes. So the crisis IPC phase 3 outcomes are likely to persisting. Next slide, please. For Zimbabwe, just a quick summary of the current situation. So we definitely know that we have those southern traditionally dry areas and also extreme northern areas, which I guess even in a good season, in most cases is affected by dry conditions. So in those areas, unproduced stocks have either run out or are already or fast depleting. And it's all to do with the below average production in those specific areas. I know the story for Zimbabwe is a bit confusing, and also I know there's been some efforts to try and have an IPC analysis which hasn't materialized yet. I'm sure efforts are still underway to get that done. Regardless of the overall stocks that are reported for Zimbabwe in those areas, definitely production was below average, and we're beginning to see fast depletion of unproduced staple. So, and supply in markets across surplus and deficit producing areas continue to be typically low due to below normal 2021, 2022 production. And also, I guess one of the things that is affecting markets is the government control on free grain trade. Meaning grain is supposed to be procured through the Grain Marketing Board. And definitely because of pricing issues, definitely, farmers are likely to kind of reduce their supplies into the common markets. Obviously, it's not allowed to do that. So it's also partly affecting the status of supplies in those markets. And maize grain prices have also been above normal, and they continue to increase. It's interesting to note that prices in the surplus producing areas usually they should be around $3 per about a 17.5 kgs bucket, but they are $4 to $5. And it's all to do with the kind of issues that we've talked about, limited supplies and the demand that comes with below average production. And so that certainly tells you that households will struggle in terms of accessing those commodities on the market. Another key development for Zimbabwe is water shortages, which are worsening in many areas. And this is affecting mostly the low rainfall southwest and extreme northern areas that I've already alluded to. And pasture and livestock conditions in those areas, once again, is deteriorating, and this is due to limited water supplies for consumption for livestock, and also poor pasture conditions when we are kind of watching on this. But the current situation shows they are deteriorating. Next slide, please. On our projected outcomes, just like we've observed with Mozambique and Madagascar, we are expecting an earlier start of the lean season in those deficits parts of southern, eastern, western, and northern eastern Zimbabwe, where unproduced stocks are fast depleting, as I've already alluded to. Then household reliance on market purchases is definitely expected to be limited due to weak purchasing power. Zimbabwe, we certainly know the issues around inflation and complex macroeconomic issues, which is also affecting the pricing issues. There is the currency debacle and so forth, which keeps on changing, and that definitely has impacts on the pricing of commodities. And then we are expecting, under the projected, that our poor households will likely to engage in consumption coping strategies such as reducing consumption and skipping meals, and also they are likely to also employ those high-cost livelihood strategies such as a typical labor migration, selling livestock, to unsustainable levels. And so as a result, in these areas that I've already discussed, we're expecting IPC phase 3 to persist across most of these deficit areas all the way to March, not 2022, but 2023. My apologies. Just to indicate that this is more like work of those that are more like doing independent analysis. We know that there hasn't been any kind of multi-stakeholder IPC analysis in Zimbabwe, but that doesn't mean that we need to fold our hands and do nothing. We can kind of be upfront and at least do something. So from that kind of work, we don't expect food insecurity outcomes to be below IPC phase 3 in those areas that I've mentioned. Next slide, I guess that's my last slide. Let's look at the situation for Angola. For those of us who have been studying closely the events in Angola, we have those provinces like Namib, Kunene, Huila, and these are areas that we know have had serious problems with rainfall performance, and last year they were equally affected. And so for these areas, long discussions have shown that IPC phase 3 outcomes continue to persist, and these areas definitely require humanitarian assistance to reduce food gaps and protect livelihoods. Once again, just to mention that there's a proper IPC that is going to happen in this area probably around October, if all things work out well, September, October. But earlier kind of analysis shows us that IPC phase 3 outcomes are likely to persist in these areas. The lean season in this area, in these provinces, will also likely to start earlier than usual. From October to January, food prices are expected to be higher than average, and more poor households will be reliant on wild foods and food assistance. Of course, on the economic front, we've seen some improvement on oil prices, but that hasn't translated into something meaningful to those areas and that have these serious problems with food insecurity. And then incomes from labor and other livelihood activities are expected to be below average and definitely won't be sufficient to cover both food and non-food essentials from November through January. And once again, on the purchasing power, we are expecting that for poor households likely to be weak, and that will definitely affect their access to staple on the market, especially on those southwestern parts of Angola. Livestock in those areas, we certainly know that there is some less reasonable level of livestock activities in those areas. But definitely we are expecting further deterioration through October due to poor pasture and decrease in availability of water. So we don't know how the conditions will prevail beyond October, but certainly before the next rain season, we are expecting some deterioration of pasture conditions, and that will affect livestock conditions and also prices. I guess that does it for the selected areas that we had prepared. And on this note, perhaps just to check if there are any questions from any one of us, any questions, any comments. I'm just checking in the chat box to see if there's anything there. There's nothing so far, but I see Mina has just raised her hand. If you could please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks so much for the comprehensive overview. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation just a quick note about Malawi, and maybe this is a question for later, maybe, but I was wondering what the read is on for Malawi this year. I know you didn't include them because there were certain maybe in country they weren't so sure that it would be a hotspot area, but I was just wondering what the situation was, what the read was on for Malawi. On our end, I think we're very concerned about the upcoming lean season for them. So I was just wondering if other colleagues or Chair, if you had some input specifically on Malawi. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. Perhaps before I get into that, I saw David also raising his hand. Perhaps maybe, do you want to come in on that or?
Okay, thank you. It's an additional question, actually, the situation for Zambia as well. So I wanted to also find out, because I take note all the neighboring countries seem to have almost a similar weather conditions. Of course, you mentioned there are those that are very critical, but I think it would also be good if we also had some data on Zambia as well, so that also assists for programming and interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina and David, for those questions. Maybe if I can start with Malawi. There's some consistent information and evidence that the southern parts of the country are equally in a very concerning state, mainly because we know certainly those areas have high levels of poverty. I mean, this is a fact, and that has been worsened by dry conditions that have persisted in those areas that I prefer to call chronically food insecure. So even in a good season, those areas will almost always have serious issues. And I think for this just ended agricultural season, we also seen the ugly face of cyclones, which resulted in some significant levels of floods, which damaged crops. And so an aggregate analysis of all those key drivers paints a picture where households in those areas at the present moment are certainly having outcomes that are no better than IPC phase 3. So definitely Malawi is on the radar. We are just hoping to get slightly more information that can allow us to probably provide a more detailed discussion on this. If we happen to get satisfactory information, we might include it in the slides that we are going to be presenting by Riasco. But I just want to promise everyone that we are definitely going to have a more detailed analysis for Malawi, as it's presenting some serious issues which also require the attention of development partners and everyone, as we certainly know that there are IPC phase 3 outcomes in those areas, and it's possible that we could even be having, there is potential for worse outcomes in some of those districts in the southern parts of the country. And coming on to Zambia, definitely you are correct that Zambia, I know the southern parts, especially bearing more to the western portions of Zambia, there has been some serious issues. That area, once again, is some kind of an outlier where rainfall has not performed well, not just last year, but perhaps for the past couple of years, it hasn't been performing very well in that portion of the country. Much as we acknowledge that in general, production has been reasonably average for Zambia at national level, I just want to allude to the fact that there are those portions like that southwestern portion of the country where definitely households will face some significant deficits, and definitely we are also expecting some concerning IPC outcomes, perhaps to the tune of phase 2, phase 3 in those areas. So definitely, David, we are more than happy, perhaps in our next presentations in the next coming few months, to also probably go beyond just these hotspot areas, to make sure that we kind of also project some of those areas even in high producing portions of the region. Colleagues, I don't know if there's anyone with any additional comments on those two countries where we have those pertinent questions. Seeing none, I guess that means that there's some level of satisfaction, and allow me then to move on to the next presentation, which is on agriculture, and Kuzai is going to take us through that that component. But as we do so, Selam is just probably sent some message to say we need to complete the attendance register, if we can do so. Please, colleagues. So I see another question which is saying, any evidence of migration due to food insecurity? Arnold, if you could probably elaborate a little bit more. Are you referring to just Southern Africa in general, or in any specific country?
Thank you, Godfrey. I just mentioned, thanks for the presentation. My name is Arnold. I'm DRL specialist with IOM Regional Office in South Africa. I just wanted to find out, I know probably this might be outside the scope of this, but any evidences or any information around movement of people because of the situation you just shared on food security in some of these countries, the countries you selected, Mozambique, Angola, and Malawi, not in Southern Africa, but specifically in your assessment of the food insecurity. Could there be any cases of displacements or movement of people as a result of this scenario or projected scenarios? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arnold, for this, and I'll just give you a general picture on especially Mozambique, Madagascar, and a bit of Angola. For southern Madagascar, yes, it's typical that you have movement of people into some of those, especially eastern areas that are usually very good. But I think this time around, it looks very limited because the eastern corridor of Madagascar was affected by cyclones. And for the first time, for those of us who have been looking at it, we've actually seen outcomes beyond IPC phase two in the eastern portion of the country, which is quite very rare. Usually it's quite a self-sustaining kind of a region for Madagascar. There's a lot of rice production in that area, and also other crops grown there, a little bit of vanilla as well, but they have been affected by the cyclone. So movement is happening, but probably at a slower rate in those areas because they were equally affected. So you would naturally then expect to start seeing longer distance movement, perhaps into more central portions of the country, but there hasn't been that adequate data so far for me to make a big story about it. Then for Mozambique, obviously by the nature of the driving factor, especially conflict, there's a lot of population movement in and out of Cabo Delgado. The situation is such that whenever there's a big problem, when there's a big attack, definitely people move out. But there's also been a different, probably level, more like type of movement where some people are trying to coming into it to assess and see if it's possible to get back to normal life, but that keeps on being more like disrupted. So there's a lot of movement around Cabo Delgado either way. So that's another area where probably in general we have some movement, but once again, we might need to do a little bit more of some homework in that area. For southern Angola, it's typical for those areas that are pastoral, where there's a lot of livestock rearing. Definitely, there's some movement that do expect, though there are indications that this time around there is some increased levels of movement of populations in the affected areas, which could be beyond the typical levels, and it's all because people are moving to look for opportunities to get food through either additional work or any other thing that can exist. And there were some kind of arguments to say there has been some movement even into Namibia. We still need once again to do a little bit of some research on that, but there has been some reported movement of some people from those southwestern parts of Angola into Namibia. So at the present moment, that's all that I can give you offhand, but otherwise we are happy to more like focus a little bit more on migration in our next editions of the meetings. All right, colleagues, allow me to move on to FAO. We are going to provide an update on agriculture. Over to you, Kuzai.
Thanks, Godfrey, and good morning, colleagues. Like what Godfrey said, I'm going to make a presentation on the update on agriculture on behalf of Sina and Croatia, who are not available today. Next slide, Salam. So this presentation basically is going to talk to the outbreak of pests and diseases as they become an issue for the food and nutrition security for the region. Next slide. There is a serious FMD outbreak in the region. This was presented in the last, I think, discussions. However, South Africa, as we speak, is facing a huge challenge, and they've already put in place movement restrictions and vaccinations. For those that know how to the diseases, basically in terms of its control, they need to restrict movement of animals as well as vaccinations. As of the 26th of August, the restrictions were already put in place in most parts of the country. But if you recall, we had a report where the FMD was detected in Zambia, and we now have confirmation also in Namibia, Malawi, and Mozambique. And just to note that this is one of the region is actually facing a very serious outbreak of foot and mouth disease. I know the slide is not including Zim, but I know the northern parts of Zim is facing some restrictions in terms of movement of cattle from those regions. Next slide, Salem. There's also an outbreak of CBPP, contagious bovine pleural pneumonia. It has been reported in Namibia, and already Namibia has requested FAO to provide technical assistance. It started in the Kavango West, however, it has already spread to other regions of Oshikoto, Omasati, and Oakwena regions. And to date, we've confirmed 100 cases with about 60 deaths, cattle deaths. And the animals that are at risk, about 1 million, just above 1 million, in all the regions in Namibia. The disease actually started in the Kavango region, and it also might impact on other countries in, for example, southern Angola, as well as western Zambia. And if you recall from what Godfrey spoke to just a while ago, southern Angola is facing very high acute food insecurity and nutrition issues, and this impact also is going to impact on those people that have cattle. Western Zambia is the same. If you've seen the results, it's also facing a bit of increased food insecurity. So this is going to push pressure on the food security situation for the three countries. Next slide, Salem. There's also an outbreak of fish disease, EUS. I will not try to pronounce this. I'm sorry. But however, it's a suspected case of the disease has been reported in Mitundu area, in the district of Lilongwe. You know Lilongwe, so I mean Malawi has got a very large water body, Lake Malawi, and hence this is going to really have a serious impact on the country. The Ministry of Agriculture is actually taking a mapping exercise and interventions to mitigate the outbreak of this syndrome. Next slide, Salem. In terms of the impact these diseases are going to have, you know, FMD and the pneumonia, these are economic diseases, meaning that they'll have a very big strain on the local purchases and sales, as well as exports of livestock. So we expect also an impact in terms of the food and nutrition security situation in those countries in Namibia, south of Angola, and western Zambia. We also expect livelihoods to be impacted if they're going to lose cattle. Already in Namibia, they are losing cattle. So the livelihoods are going to be impacted in terms of these two economic diseases. In terms of the response, I've indicated Malawi has requested FAO to provide support, and the FAO has since provided support to Namibia in terms of responding to the pneumonia threat. And as such, we expect that the results are going to be shared with humanitarian partners. However, in terms of the threat, they're covering not only one country, and these are transboundary in nature. The approach has been to take a regional approach, drawing lessons and best practices in terms of what we've done, what we've seen for the locust control interventions that were done, and other previous livestock transboundary control interventions. Next slide, Salem. So in terms of looking out for the next cropping season, as well as the winter cropping for countries that rely on secondary production of crops, for example, also Malawi that does rice during this period, as well as other countries. There is a dialogue that has been initiated. Next slide, Salem. There's a dialogue that has been initiated by FAO and partners, SADC and NAMAC. They've already done a study on the likelihood of the impact of the Ukraine crisis. The region is dependent on fertilizer importation. Even South Africa, it relies on importation of fertilizer, mostly from Ukraine, Russia, corridor, and other countries within the region. How also, though they depend on the from the Ukraine and Russia, they also depend on South Africa. So there is a dialogue that has been slated from the 27th to the 29th of September to discuss the cost of fertilizers and the impact thereof in the upcoming season, bearing in mind the vulnerability that smallholder farmers face and the importance of fertilizers for our cereals such as maize, and also, of course, rice in those in countries that produce rice, Zambia and Malawi. So for those that still want to take part in the dialogue, please get in touch with Salem so that she will then forward the names to the organizers of this event. So the event in itself looks forward to creating awareness and sharing good practices and ensuring one collective voice in terms of advocating for the mitigating the impact of the conflict that is actually ongoing to the most vulnerable farming households. I think that's all. That's the last slide, Salem, for the agriculture update. I'm not sure if it is. I think that's the last slide. Yes. I welcome any comments from you. Please get in touch with Salem if there is anyone who wants to take part in the dialogue. It's very important as it also impacts on the next production season. Over.
Thanks very much, Kudzai, for that crucial update on agriculture. As we know, certainly that definitely the 2022 to 2023 agri season is on the cards. So I just want to find out from us if there are any questions, comments from arising from Kudzai's presentation. I see Mina's hand is up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and sorry for the many questions today. Thank you also, Kudzai, for your presentation. Just a quick one on this dialogue event. For WFP, we're really looking into understanding national requirements and what sort of support government might be needing on the fertilizer front this upcoming year. I understand it'll cover things like, best practices for households and whatnot, but will it also be covering things like the types of fertilizer that are typically used and the requirements and that sort of information also? I'm just trying to figure out if it's something that our supply chain colleagues might also be interested in. Over.
Definitely, Mina. It's expected to have those items discussed. But like I've said, please forward the names so that the colleagues that are organizing this dialogue will get in touch with you directly. But of course, yes, we expect to look into the types of fertilizers and any other mitigation processes that can be done for smallholder farmers. Over.
Thank you very much, Kudzai.
Colleagues, any additional questions? In the chat box, I don't seem to see anything, and I don't seem to see any additional hands raised, and I think Keto has just added that, just to add that the FMD or serotype also affect sheep and goats. Thanks, Keto. All right, colleagues, on this note, we just 5 minutes behind schedule, and that's not too bad. So I'm going to just leave this time to a presentation by FuseNet and WFP on prices and markets. Over to you. I guess it's John's, right?
Yes, Godfrey. I'll present on behalf of my colleagues from WFP. Can we move to the next slide, Salam? So we'll start the presentation with the standard FAO food price index trends, and then try to show how this could potentially affect the food supply chains, as well as the impact the fertilizer supply chain. So I'll ride a lot on what Godfrey and Kuzai have already presented. I apologize ahead if I have to repeat some of the things that they have said, but I'll try to skate around and not repeat. When we look at the top chart showing the FAO food price index, the top graph, the red graph, shows a sharp decline from June to July, an 8.6% monthly decline in the food price index. This is the fourth consecutive decline, as you can see on that top graph, and it's led largely by declines in vegetable oil prices as well as cereal prices. The dairy and the meat also contributed to this, but the greatest contribution for this decline was from vegetable oils and cereal prices. This is good news in terms of global inflation pressures. As you can see, the graph is heading closer to the 2021 levels, and this could help in toning the food price inflation pressures. But specifically on the main categories, the cereal price index, the bottom chart, it also shows the decline in cereal prices, 11.5% from June to July, even though it remains above the 2021 levels. This was led by declines for wheat, as well as for coarse grains, maize in particular. Wheat prices came down 14.5% from June to July, thanks to the unblocking of the Ukraine's Black Sea ports and the resumption of exports. Quite an amount of ships have collected grain from the 3 ports in the Black Sea area, and have managed to freight over 600,000 metric tons of grain and other foodstuffs. But this decline is also due to the increased availability of wheat coming from the harvest in the Northern Hemisphere. For coarse grains, which includes maize, we have observed 11.2% decline in prices. Again, Ukraine is one of those drivers, the unblocking of the ports. Ukraine is a major maize exporter, but we also have improved availability of maize globally from the harvest in South America, Argentina, and Brazil. Rice prices also declined for the first month in 2022, largely because of inconsistent export demand. But moving on to the vegetable oil price index, we can see on the bottom chart there, the vegetable oil graph is the one on the top. It shows quite some sharp declines, again, from March this year. The latest monthly decline was 19.2%, which is quite significant, given that our region is a net importer of vegetable oils. This price decline is due to improved availability of palm oil from Indonesia and new supplies for soy as well as rapeseed, and also subdued global demand for sunflower oil. So globally, good news in terms of global food prices. They are coming down, including, meat and dairy, given that relationship between cereals and dairy, cereals providing feed for dairy and the meat sectors. So would expect that this will benefit our region, but there is not that one-to-one type of relationship. But we'll wait and see. So far, prices in the region are still elevated. Next slide, please. So the resumption of Ukraine exports, yes, it has helped in improving supplies. The markets have responded positively to this, but a lot of the procurement for humanitarian food assistance had already taken place, and quantities are being delivered. But going forward, I think the opening and resumption of Ukrainian exports is positive news for the markets. And yes, they've responded positively. But it's important to also note that the resumption of Ukrainian exports is not a singular solution to the high commodity prices that we experience currently. Yes, crude oil prices have also added, some downward pressure. July prices for crude oil came down, so that has helped in reducing freight costs. But the issue is that these arrangements we have between the United Nations, Ukraine, Turkey, and Russia are very fragile. We have noticed that some of the ports came under attack just after the agreement was signed, and the crisis itself is ongoing. So it's something to really watch, but the opening and the resumption of exports has given some life to improving supplies of food globally. The remaining concern is around the volatility of international crude oil prices. They remain volatile. We know the crisis in the Baltic Sea is still there. We know there are sanctions on Russia. So the geopolitical context is still very volatile. Despite July prices for crude oil coming down, for our region in the domestic economies, pump prices may not necessarily come down. They are a bit sticky. We understand a number of governments had brought in subsidies. They also removed fuel levies to cushion motorists from high pump prices. So these measures are being taken away. Now that the prices are coming down, They are being taken away also because of budgetary pressures. So we may see or observe international oil prices coming down, but it doesn't translate to lower pump prices in our region because of some of these country measures that were brought in and are still being used to manage fuel prices in the region. Next slide, please. So a little bit on the regional market dynamics. As I mentioned, Godfrey also mentioned this, that prices remain elevated in a number of markets, and they're expected to rise. The lean season, is already started, as Godfrey mentioned. So there will be increased reliance on market purchases. So that increased market demand will push prices up. There's also increased export demand from our neighboring regions, East Africa, the Horn. We know there's a multi-season drought in that part of the continent, and they've been drawing grain from Southern Africa. The good news is the main exporting countries have kept their borders open, and these countries must be commended despite registering a decline in harvest for 21-22 production season. But there is indications of preference for non-GMO maize. So that could benefit maize suppliers from Zambia who have non-GMO maize. South Africa is largely more than 85% GMO, and their participation in the region may be a bit limited. But the traditional markets of Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, Eswatini will absorb some of the South African surplus maize, including the international export markets. Tanzania's role will be limited by the reduced harvest. No wonder East Africa region is extending its procurement sourcing from Southern Africa. So the bottom line is the food component of the headline inflation is expected to increase. So CPI has not reached its peak yet for 2022. So we expect inflation levels to continue rising. They will not crest during this year. It's projected it could, continue rising as the lean season progresses. So with that, you would expect further, policy tightening by the monetary authorities to increase interest rates. And given that we have high fuel prices, high interest rates, it could have an impact on production in the coming season, commercial production in the coming season. Next slide, please. Kudzai did talk a little bit about the exposure of the region to some of the crises when it comes to fertilizer markets. Indeed, Southern Africa is import dependent when it comes to fertilizer, especially those 4 surplus maize producers of South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, and Malawi. They depend on fertilizer imports. So we have seen what you might call a triple shock in terms of prices. First, the restricted availability of feedstock. Secondly, the crisis itself, the Ukraine crisis, causing supply, disruptions. And thirdly, the sanctions on Russia and Belarus, some of the main fertilizer suppliers. So this triple threat is wreaking havoc for our regional fertilizer markets. We may not have seen much of the impact during the 21-22 summer season because the Ukraine crisis came in right in the middle of this season. But we'll see the full effects of the crisis during this coming 22-23 production season. Already, the inventory levels within countries is quite reduced. We have seen reports indicating that only a part of the total demand has been positioned. The procurement pace has been low. The prices are also elevated, which makes the capacity to bring in the expected normal volumes, challenged for both public and the private sector. The import bill has gone up. So there is also hesitancy regarding understanding how much can farmers demand at such high prices. Demand will definitely be affected, demand for fertilizer by farmers, because prices have gone up. So this inflationary environment is also not going to help as the cost of internal distribution will keep the retail prices of fertilizer elevated. So generally, there is an increase in fertilizer prices, and the food prices, we know they've increased, but fertilizer prices have increased way ahead of food prices. So it points to potential reduction in returns to fertilizer use. So it could give us some indication that the demand as well as the application rates could be affected negatively this coming season. And we know that is or could lead to poor yields and resultantly lower output during the 2022-23 production season. Next slide, please. So the next slide, which happens to be my last slide, is simply showing the country level exposure level and the detail about that exposure. This has been information shared by the Africa Watch from the Africa Fertilizer Organization. We can see the middle column there, the exposure to the Ukraine crisis is quite strong across all those countries in the region. They are all procuring fertilizer from the Baltic region. They import both products as well as formulations for local blending. Zimbabwe does rely on Russia for ammonium nitrate. Currently, with sanctions on Russia, the supplies of ammonium nitrate have almost disappeared. That could, sound very levels for the coming season, especially for maize and tobacco production in Zimbabwe. For South Africa, sourcing has always been from the Baltic region for monoammonium phosphate as well as muriate of potash. Now they're looking at alternative sources in the Middle East. But by and large, prices in these countries have risen year on year, and demand is expected to be really low. And we are yet to know among some of the mitigation measures that governments are considering. For example, in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and potentially Mozambique, how much subsidized fertilizer will be available at. Those details haven't come through yet. So we are eagerly awaiting to hear this. But we have only 2 months to the planting season, and this information is quite critical now, and the situation doesn't look good. But other factors, for example, in South Africa, when you look at tractor sales, they've been high. The weather is looking good. The projections, as Godfrey has mentioned. So the hectarage at a minimum could be maintained, but we are yet to see what happens to yields. I want to stop there for comments and questions. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Questions
Godfrey?
for this presentation. Quite loaded, a lot of information, very useful analysis. Thanks for all the work behind it. Colleagues, here we are. An update on prices. Any questions, comments arising from this presentation? Yes, Simon, how are you doing? And please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Godfrey, and thank you also for the presentation from Jonas. I have 2 questions or comments rather. The first one relates to the prices, maize prices, and it's related to the fertilizer. Looking at what particularly for countries like Malawi and Zambia, that are neighboring countries like Tanzania, and generally the East African region that did not have a very good season, and the produce was very poor. And in some parts of those countries, particularly for Malawi and Zambia, some parts had good harvest. And so my question is, how is this going to affect movement and then also affect the prices when you look at it in general in terms of movements, and if countries have restrictions or is going to run out in a couple of months to come? Then secondly, a number of countries that were during the IPC analysis, one of the assumptions that they had relates to the fact that the Ukraine-Russian crisis definitely is going to affect fertilizer prices. And as we move towards the cropping, the planting season, that assumption is still on. And of course, a few countries are talking about, subsidizing fertilizer and so on. So just a general comment is I don't know whether that is something that is going to change the way, the season when it starts in terms of the farmers who need to buy these fertilizers for planting, and whether governments are really going to manage this and how that is going to impact, and if the crisis persists into next year, how that is going to affect food security situation. So those two comments and further questions. Thank you. Over. Back to you.
Thanks
Godfrey,
very
you
much,
want me
Simon.
to-
Do you want to add any few things on that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Simon. I'll start with the last one regarding the Ukraine crisis on fertilizer prices. So yes, as I was explaining, we have seen the same budgets among countries for fertilizer support or fertilizer subsidies. Budgets have not increased. So prices have increased. So what we expect is with the same budget, the quantities that governments can procure or subsidize will be reduced certainly compared to last year. So this coming season, the availability of fertilizers for smallholder farmers will be a challenge. For commercial producers, as I mentioned in South Africa, we have seen indications that the earnings last year were good. We have seen it through tractor sales, but interest rates have gone up in South Africa. So input loans will definitely be costly, but prices are relatively up. So commercial farmers have room to navigate some of these high fertilizer prices in South Africa and the other countries. But for smallholder farmers who have depended on subsidies, the situation may not be as easy to navigate this coming season. The first question on prices and flows of grain out of Zambia and Malawi transiting through Tanzania to Kenya. Yes, I know, Simon, you have an interest. You want to have your...
That's right.
Yeah, you want to secure your staple. The good news is, yes, the flows have started, going through, particularly from Zambia. These are formal flows. They are, government has allowed movement, but a little bit different from Malawi, where the flows are more informal. But they are there. The traders are procuring from Malawi, even volumes from eastern Zambia, bordering with Malawi, are going into Malawi and then proceeding to the north via Mbirima border into Tanzania en route to Kenya. So these flows are there, but as I mentioned, informal flows tend to have high transaction costs, but Zambia is exporting through Tunduma and exporting directly to Kenya. They've been, good facilitation from both governments to allow this trade to proceed unhindered. So that's a good sign that, yes, farmers in Zambia will be able to have good earnings to invest in production in the coming season. So yes, prices in both Malawi and Zambia have started to rise way too early compared to normal seasons. Typically, the price would start rising in September, but we have seen prices in Malawi rising as early as May. So yeah, because of other factors, again, you know, the devaluation. But yes, prices have started increasing. As Godfrey had indicated, the lean season is coming a little bit earlier than normal. But, you know, good prices benefit farmers to invest in more production in the coming season. Over to you, Godfrey.
Thanks, Jones, for that reaction, and I hope it clarifies some of the questions that Simon had raised. I don't seem to see any other question at this point in time. I just want to hand over this time to Maxwell, who's going to just give us an update on the World Vision's humanitarian response to date.
Thank you so much, Godfrey, for this time. Hoping I can move a bit faster and try to catch up on the time that we have lost. I will stop showing my video, but you can move on to the next slide. So I just thought that maybe I could highlight the key messages just in case we do not get through the whole presentation. As we have seen from the SADC Regional Vulnerability Assessment synthesis report, that 55.7 million people are food insecure in the region, looking at the 2022-2023 marketing year. And this is the children's crisis. In any crisis, children suffer the brunt of that particular crisis, and we need to act now to prevent any deterioration in the humanitarian crisis. But also, as already has been highlighted, conflict, COVID-19, and climate change are interacting to create a new and worsening hunger hotspots, even within the countries where we have generally responded during what has been considered as seasonal hunger period. We have seen new areas becoming vulnerable as well. And timing is running out, and we cannot sit and watch and hope that this will go away. Any delay in responding will see some households resorting to negative coping mechanisms. So we have learned from the COVID-19 response how collective action is critical, and we continue to see that the risk persists, but we still need to work collectively and respond to the hunger that is within this particular region and other regions. Next slide, please. So just to give you a synopsis of how World Vision responds within the region, we have long-term development programs that are multi-sectoral, and they are funded through child sponsorship. And child sponsorship, for those that may not be familiar, is a mechanism in which individuals like you and me can make a contribution towards a child, and these resources are then pulled together within a particular, say, district or sub-district, and the resources are used to respond to the rights that are at risk for children. But we also have grant-funded interventions within some of these areas. Then we have advocacy and justice for children, in which we work with national governments and other stakeholders on policies, whether it's the development of these policies or just pressure for the implementation of these policies that enhance child well-being, or at least that enhance the access to basic social services for children. Then we have the disaster management, which looks at the whole disaster management cycle, but with a particular focus on preparedness and humanitarian responses. and then community-based disaster risk management. Next slide. So as part of the global hunger that response that we have seen across the different governments and different agencies, World Vision declared a global hunger response for 25 countries from April 2022 to September 2023. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this was the start of our response to hunger. It was just a concerted effort to provide support to some of these countries. And what it means essentially is that within the organization, we then redirect human and financial resources towards those 25 priority countries. But we still continue to respond to the rest of the countries. Next slide. And within the region, the two countries that were included within these 25 countries or within the global hunger response are Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But we also are currently looking at Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Those are the countries within where World Vision has a presence, where we believe there is a need to just enhance visibility of the crisis and also harness whatever resources that remain available. But I've included the full listing of the countries here. You see that East Africa has the most number of countries. I know that a number of colleagues here also have their portfolios include East Africa. But the significance is that while we have this hunger situation within the region, we have to compete with the rest of the world pretty much in accessing resources that are critical to save lives. Next slide. So the listing of what we have achieved so far or what we continue to do so far is not an exhaustive one, and it is in no way trying to reduce the value or the contributions that are made by our partners and donors, but it is just a way to give a sense of what some of the major contributors, or what we've been able to do with some of the major contributors within the region. So this is information up to end of June, where we have reached 5.1 million people with food assistance, which includes cash or voucher as well as in-kind food. But most of these responses are also multi-sectoral as much as the funding flexibility allows. Next slide. So in this slide, it is a bit packed, but I just want to highlight that within the in-kind programs, for instance, it's not just food assistance to meet the immediate need, but we also would include objectives that seek to strengthen the livelihood and also objectives that seek to strengthen access to education and life skills as well as nutrition. Then also, just to highlight some of the key partners, the World Food Program, the United States government, that includes USAID as well as USDA. We have also other donors that I will not list. You may see the 3 UN. I have a slide on the 3 UN, which include UNICEF, UN OCHA, as well as UNHCR. So these are some of the donors, or at least intermediary organizations, that have contributed to the achievements that we have made so far, and we anticipate that we'll continue to use the resources from these pipelines to respond to the situation as it evolves within the region. Next slide. So this slide, I just want to highlight the growth in the use of cash transfers within the humanitarian sector. As you can see, there's a comparison between this time last year and currently. It has grown from 11 million to 23 million within the work that we are doing within the region. And I should highlight that it is critical to use cash transfers where the market allows this to happen without causing any local inflation. But we have invested significantly within the organization in the capacity development of staff, in market analysis, as well as looking at the different transfer mechanisms to ensure that we make use of the efficiencies that exist where possible. Next slide. This is the slide that I alluded to earlier, that the 3 UN, inclusive of UNICEF, UNHCR, as well as OCHA, they've contributed significantly to some of the work that are a response to the effect that even in a hunger crisis, the issues are not just limited to access to food. You can see the listing of the different other sectors or other interventions that we need to do as we respond to hunger. I think we need also to make sure that when we communicate hunger, we communicate it broader than just the need for access to food. Next slide. So this is our draft response plan across the different countries within the region. I just included also the information that came from the synthesis report, but based on the countries in which World Vision is present. So we intend to reach just over 6 million people with a funding target of $125 million. But this is aspirational, subject to funding. Next slide. So some of the challenges that we've seen related to resource mobilization are the fact that the impact of slow onset disasters, which are the most common within the region, are not immediately visible, and people would rather focus on other places. We see the focus on Ukraine currently to the detriment of the responses elsewhere. The need is definitely there in Ukraine, but I think the messaging that we need to continuously highlight is that we have needs within Southern Africa as well. Then also that there are vulnerabilities related to structural or governance issues, which many donors would highlight as requiring development funding and not humanitarian funding. I think we need also to be cognizant of the fact that regardless of the underlying cause of say the humanitarian situation, we need to deploy humanitarian funding as well when that need arises. And also the cyclical nature of the disasters within the region, particularly with the droughts and tropical storms. Many people have begun to see this as a norm, to say at some point the population in Southern Africa may need to eat less than the 3 meals, where 1 meal per day is considered normal. It is probably something that we need to change through messaging of saying we should not normalize something that is actually a violation of the human right. Then also a significant number of countries within the region are considered to be lower middle income countries, and sometimes it's difficult to convince some donors to put in resources for humanitarian, where there is a belief that the national governments should be prioritizing their funding to channel it towards the humanitarian assistance. Next slide. These are some of the recommendations, some might be drawing from what we included as the key messages. But as the Food and Nutrition Security Working Group, it will be critical for us to develop key messages that capture the impact of hunger beyond just the need for food, so that we may at least impress upon the hearts of those that might see the hunger as normal within the region. And also to need to highlight that hunger and COVID-19 could actually derail the gains that have been made to address HIV or AIDS. We definitely are within the context where HIV and AIDS is still a reality that increases the vulnerability of the population, and sometimes some of these issues arise, we may forget that, and we would need a pronged approach to responding to the crisis, given the need to address the immediate hunger, but also to strengthen recovery. John's highlighted how, say, fertilizer prices might make it difficult for an average smallholder farmer, for instance, to use that because the margins are very low, and if you then invest the expensive in expensive inputs, then whatever you get out of it might not make the business viable. And also we need to review and refine some of the recommended resilience development initiatives, as some of the climate smart agriculture techniques are no longer effective. I guess with the severity of the climate related hazards, we notice that the things that in the past have worked to conserve moisture may no longer be effective, and we need to be reviewing that and making sure that whatever we recommend to farmers is actually something that would be effective for them. And when we look at the impact of cyclones that pretty much come through the Mozambican channel and affects the rest of the region, we should be investing more in the coastal area resilience interventions, so that the impact does not have far-reaching effects beyond at least where they make the landfall. I'll stop here for now. Thank you. Over to you, Godfrey.
Thanks, Maxwell, for a moving presentation, quite very informative. And it's great to know all that World Vision is doing and planning to support efforts to improve food security in the region. Wanted to just check if there are any questions and reactions to Maxwell's presentation. In the chat box, I don't seem to see anything, and neither am I seeing any hands raised. So that speaks of how well the presentation was. And once again, Maxwell, thank you very much for that presentation. Allow me to move on to the next presentation, which is on nutrition response planning interventions. And I think it's Marjorie taking us through this presentation.
All right, thanks so much. Just confirming if you can hear me.
We can hear you quite loud and clear, Marjorie. Please go ahead.
All right, thanks. So I see we only have 15 minutes, so I'll try to make sure that we go through it very fast. Next slide. So for this one, I'm presenting on behalf of UNICEF as well as World Food Program, who are online. Just in terms of starting off for the regional highlight, for this year alone, we note that, still the issues of stunted children remains adverse, especially in the SADC region. And so far, 18.6 million children had been projected to be stunted for this. When it comes in terms of acute malnutrition, anticipating 6.5 million, and out of that, the projection is 1.7 million. And just to highlight, the key countries that are contributing the most. So we have the DRC, CAR as well, and then we have Mozambique and Madagascar contributing to the high caseload for wasted children. Now, in terms of for the whole programming, I think what we have noted is that, the acute malnutrition still remains an issue, specifically for some of the Southern Africa countries, with the highest admissions being noted for Angola. And overall, for the acute malnutrition, it's the key issues are a combination of various shocks, which include both the climatic, the issues of, we've already just discussed in terms of the increasing high food prices, and of course, in terms of insecurity, specifically in the Cabo Delgado region and the impact of COVID-19. I think for this, we wanted to look at in terms of what are the key strategies that are being used. And I just want to highlight, as a nutrition sector, we have a package of intervention that have been agreed for implementation across. And majorly, this focuses both on coordination, information management, treatment and prevention of acute malnutrition. And then, of course, we look at in terms of the community mobilization for action. And then, of course, in terms of ensuring that there is the supplies provision across board. And now just to highlight, for the prevention specific actions, so this is where the micronutrient supplementation is being reflected, as well as in terms of the promotion of the IYCF action. In terms of the implementation of capacities, this is different across the various countries, and always depending in terms of the country's capacities, as well as in terms of the availability of both the human resources, but also availability of the funding to be able to execute the comprehensive nutrition packages. But non-negotiable as part of the, implementation, especially for the life-saving, is majorly this, scaling up and prevention of treatment of acute malnutrition, and specifically promotion of IYCF actions, as well as the micronutrient supplementation. Next slide. So I'll go into just the specific highlights. I think the earlier on colleagues had indicated, the situation in Angola. From the nutrition perspective, we still have, issues in the southern Angola. We've seen a lot of increased admission, especially, in Kunene region, as well as in Namibi region, as well as Huila. So overall, we had anticipated to have around 56,000 children admitted throughout the year, and we have seen the target has been surpassed. Currently, we have around 73,000 children that have been admitted for severe acute malnutrition. Now, just to indicate that, this is actually a very high caseload that has been admitted, considering that currently, it's just a subsection of the country that we are focusing on. But needless to say, the needs in Angola are really massive. Overall, for the whole country, we had a projection of above 230,000 children that were anticipated to be acutely malnourished, and this is severe acute malnutrition. And of course, for the 3 areas where we have only the 73,000. When it comes in terms of the screening and basically for the active case finding, so this has its own limitation as of now, because you find that most of the children that are coming to the health facilities are mostly a self-referral, because we haven't really had a lot of funding to support the community level actions. So far we have only had 218,000 children that have been screened for malnutrition, and we are hoping that with additional funding that was just received, then they should be able to scale up some of the active case finding and ensure that we are getting most children that are in need. Next slide. When it comes to Mozambique, so Mozambique, just to highlight, specifically, yes, Cabo Delgado remains, one of the key focus areas, but where we are seeing as well, Nampula, Zambezia, are still some of the regions that where we are receiving really an increased burden, as well as the increased admission for acute malnutrition. Just to highlight, for the target for the emergency response is 98,000, but this is for out of a country burden of over 200,000. Currently, in terms of the support, has been skewed specifically for the Cabo Delgado, and efforts are currently continuing to advocate and mobilize resources for emergency response beyond the Cabo Delgado. So as a nutrition sector, they have agreed on a number of key interventions, so including in terms of the scaling up the mobile brigades, in terms of expansion of the treatment of acute malnutrition at both community level as well as at the health facility level, and then of course in terms of ensuring that the prevention action, supplementary feeding, as well as in terms of ensuring that micronutrient supplementation is currently and ongoing. Just a little bit to highlight in terms of the admission trends, still we are seeing a very low coverage right now for the number of children who are being admitted for the programming. The discussions that we had with the team indicates that this is just because, currently the funding has not been so much available to help in terms of the community level action, including the active case finding. Next slide. Now focusing on to Malawi. So Malawi, I think what we had indicated, it's one of the areas that we have really seen a very high increase in the number of children that are being admitted. So still we have issues, a combination of factors, including, of course, the impacts of the floods, the poverty, the high poverty rates, and of course the impact of COVID-19 as well. And then of course we've had issues of cholera outbreak in some parts of the country. For planning purposes, and these are some of the activities that are currently ongoing, and just to highlight, they will be going into another planning phase within the next month to look at in terms of reviewing some of the actions. But what is currently ongoing is still, the whole full package in terms of identification of acute malnutrition prevention, as well as ensuring the micronutrient supplementation. And as you can see, in terms of the admission trends, we've had a 21% increase on the SAM admissions, and for the MAM admissions, it's actually currently over 92% increase. So again, just to highlight, overall for the admission trends for both acute and moderate acute malnutrition. So severe and moderate acute malnutrition, we've really had high increase in the number of children that have been identified and admitted. Then just moving on to my second last slide, just a little bit of focusing on the two countries, Zambia and Zimbabwe. So for Zambia and Zimbabwe, what we are seeing is much more in terms of the stable situation when it comes to acute malnutrition, and this is actually reflected in the admission trends. So as you can see, in terms of even the number of children that have been screened are below 500,000 for the year. And this is, they had actually targeted almost more children admitted, especially for 2022. But needless to say, so far, especially for the month of July, only 1,000 children were identified for acute malnutrition, and essentially what the country is indicating that the situation is becoming much more stable, even as they try to accelerate and try to find more children for service delivery. For Zimbabwe, just to highlight, yes, we have been having, a food insecurity situation. This is still not reflected on the current admission trends. And as you can see for the map highlighted on the last map there, you can see in terms of the overall admission trend for this year is actually slightly lower when you compare it to the other years. But needless to say, all the activities are ongoing, including the identification of the children, as well as ensuring that the children who have been identified for malnutrition are actually being treated, but then also they're receiving other complementary support services. And just to highlight, one of the key issues that is coming up with Zimbabwe now, we're seeing an increase in overweight and obesity, especially in the township areas. And so as of now, one of the key things has been to enhance the policy environment and ensure that we have a really streamlined way of addressing overweight and obesity, and ensuring that is also part of the program priorities for the country. And lastly, the last slide, just some of the key messages that is coming out. Yes, so the key messages and for the nutrition sector is just to ensure that we are sustaining the close monitoring of the nutrition situation. As indicated, our countries of concern currently are Angola and Mozambique, and Malawi as well. Of course, we all know Madagascar kind of right now is the situation has improved. So we are currently following the 3 countries. And then additionally also, because of the insecurity that has been happening in the DRC, I didn't get to present the data today, but I will share it in the next meeting. We are really seeing escalation of both the needs as well, and of course high levels of displaced population that are actually in need of nutrition services. One thing that still is sustained is the whole resource mobilization, especially for Angola, Malawi. Malawi, we had over 60% underfunding. Still Angola as well, we still have the over 60% underfunded, specifically for nutrition. And of course, this is ongoing to ensure that support for both life-saving treatment as well as prevention actions are ongoing. And of course, one of the key messages that we are really initiating and ensuring, the whole cross collaboration with other sectors, including the social protection, food security, as well as currently we are working with the education sector, specifically on the school feeding fund. So that is all from my side, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Marjorie, for that quick presentation, but quite loaded, and it's interesting to see the amount of work that is planned and that is taking place, which is being coordinated by our nutrition partners. And I think for those of us who have been long enough, you appreciate that this is quite commendable. It's a sector that we saw developing and doing more and more, and we are so happy and excited that there is some well-balanced analysis in the region of the general food security issues and specific nutrition issues as well. So we just want to thank you for all those plans. And colleagues, I just want to find out if there are any comments. I don't see anything in the chat box. And so far, I don't equally see any hands raised. All right, seeing none, I want to thank you once again, Marjorie, and your colleagues for putting up this great presentation, which is quite very informative and which gives us some good highlights of what's happening and what's planned in the region. Thanks a lot. Colleagues, on this note, I just want us to quickly move on to, we have one AOB item that Angela is going to take us through. So if Angela could just quickly update us on the food security and agricultural livelihoods assessment survey, please.
Thank you so much, Godfrey. And it's very brief. We're going to be circulating a survey, and we would like to request you all to fill it in, just to find out who is doing what, where, and when they're doing it in terms of food security and agricultural livelihoods assessments. So the survey will be shared as soon after this meeting. We just want to establish where the gaps are, and in order to avoid duplication of efforts. Thank you, Godfrey.
Oh, wow, that's so brief. Thanks a lot, Angela. And you have made us great in the sense that this is exactly 4 o'clock and we are done with all agenda items. just a quick reminder that next in September, we are going to have a special session on resilience, and we'll be writing to a number of us to participate or to provide some presentations during that special session. So let's get ready for that. And also just another reminder that we plan to have a planning session for the working group around November. We'll definitely share the exact dates, and it is our hope that if the situation remains like what it is with the improvements in COVID-19, in the COVID-19 situation, we plan to meet for the first time physically. So thank you very much, colleagues, and I just want to once again appreciate your support, your participation. It was so great. Today was more lively. There was a lot of participation from us and colleagues. Wish you all the best for the week, and till we meet again in September, all the best.
Thank you, Godfrey. Thank you all.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks and bye-bye.